Hi, I'm Arlen Geyer. The sun went down a little while ago. The sky's still a little light, but it's getting kind of dark. So I guess that means that in a photograph, the picture ought to be kind of dark, right? Well, not necessarily. It's just a few minutes later now, but as you see, the picture is rather light. In fact, maybe a little too light. So you see, we can change the brightness of the picture in any given lighting situation. If it's dark out, we can let more light in the camera. If it's light out, we can let less light in the camera. How much light you want to get into the camera depends on the ISO. ISO, by the way, stands for International Standards Organization. You don't have to know that. But the ISO is the sensitivity of the film or the sensor to light. The more sensitive it is, the less light is required to produce a good exposure. So obviously the less sensitive it is, the more light is required. So it sounds like a more sensitive film or sensor would be desirable, but with both film and sensors, the higher the ISO, or the more sensitive it is, the more in film grain and in digital imaging, digital noise you'll get. And digital noise is kind of like static on a radio or a TV. It disrupts the image. And so you don't want that. But that's what you get with a higher ISO. So obviously a lower ISO is desirable. With the ISO set, you want to get a specific amount of light onto the film or sensor. And so how you do that is you have two controls available to you. You have the aperture, which is the opening in the lens, and you can adjust the size of that opening. You can have a large opening, or you can make it a smaller opening, and obviously the smaller opening would let less light in at a time. And you have the shutter speed. The shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter is open. The shutter is like a curtain. It's closed in the beginning, and then when you push the shutter release button, it opens up for a moment and closes again. And that is open for a very short period of time, usually a very small fraction of a second. The aperture is, the size of the aperture is expressed as a number with an F in front of it, F4 or F8 or F16, F5.6, that kind of thing. The F actually stands for focal length, and when it's properly written, it's F slash and the number. And the reason it's written that way is that it's actually a fraction where the size of the opening, the diameter of the opening, is the fraction of your focal length over the F number. But that represents the size of the opening. And the numbers appear to be backwards. The smaller the number, the larger the opening, because it's actually the denominator of a fraction. You just have to remember that it's backwards, that a smaller number is a larger opening. So a large aperture might be F4, whereas a small aperture might be F11 or F16. The shutter speed is typically shown in fractions of a second. So you might have a 30th of a second, or a 100th of a second, or even a 1,000th of a second. And so you have some combination of a shutter speed and an aperture to produce a specific amount of light. So you've got the lens open a certain amount, and you're leaving it open for a certain amount of time, and between those two, you end up getting a specific amount of light on the sensor. And you have a lot of control, a lot of flexibility about what shutter speed and what aperture to use. And there are reasons to use different apertures and reasons to use different shutter speeds. The aperture, it's all about depth of field. This is what depth of field is about. It's how much is in focus in front of and behind what you're focused on. The shutter speed is all about controlling blur. So you might want some blur, or you might want to avoid blur, and that's what you control with the shutter speed. So it's finding a balance of those things that the exposure is all about. I hope this has been useful. Thanks.